How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Chof Daf 28 of Masechta Zevachim. Friends, today we dive in to the sugya of Pigul. How exciting is that? We've been talking about Pigul ever since the introduction to Masechta Zevachim on the first daf of Masechta Zevachim. Now we are beginning to jump in to Pigul, and we will begin today's daf with a Mishnah that gives Pigul basics, the basic sort of contours of and concepts of Pigul. As part of that Mishnah, a very specific sugya will kind of come up in the Mishnah. The hide of the fatty tail, the sugya of the sugya of the hide of the fatty tail. That's going to really be the first sugya of Daf Chof of Masechta Zevachim. And then we begin the sugya, which really will stretch out to tomorrow's stuff, the source for Pigul. Where do we learn out Pigul from? What is the source of Pigul? These are the topics of Daf Chof Daf Koyach of Masechta Zevachim. All right, friends, our daf begins on Daf Chof Zayin Amid Beis, the second of the wide lines, about 5 or 10 lines from the bottom of Daf Chof Zayin Amid Beis. Says the Mishnah, Hashoichet es hazevach. Oh, here we go. Pigul. Somebody slaughters a korban, lizrok damo bachutz, with the intention of doing zrikas adam outside of the azar, or miktzas damo bachutz, or even part of the zrikas adam to be outside of the azar. Now, so basically this Mishnah is going to be divided into two parts. Of course, when we talk about Pigul, we talk about Chutz Lizmanu and Chutz Limkomo. The first half of the Mishnah is going to focus on Chutz Limkomo, and the second half of the Mishnah is going to focus on Chutz Lizmanu. So we just learned that if one slaughters a korban with the intention of doing Zrikas Adam, or even Zrikas part of the Dam, Chutz Limkomo, outside of the Azara, outside of its proper place, or Lahaktir a Murav Bachutz, or alternatively, to burn the parts of the animal that would be burnt on the Mizbeach, one slaughters the korban. Now the Mishnah doesn't say this, but technically it could also be Kabbalah, Holacha. If we're talking about Haktaras Emurin, which we are now, it could even be Zrikas Adam. But anyways, so the Mishnah talks about slaughtering. So somebody who slaughters a korban with the intention of burning the parts that would have to be burnt on the Mizbeach, but this person has in mind that they are going to burn these parts outside of the Azare. Lechol b'sarei bachutz o kazayis b'sarei bachutz, or to eat the meat of the animal outside of the place where you're allowed to eat it. So for kachim, that would be the Azar. For kachim kalim, that would be Yerushalayim. Or even a kazayis of the meat outside of where you're allowed to eat it. Now, this is going to be the focus of the first part of today's Gemara, which is olechol kazayis me'ora alya bachutz, or to eat a kazayis from the hide of the fatty tail. Sheeps and goats, okay, technically sheep and goats have these fatty tails. We got any shoichtim here at Babylon Talmud? But I guess sheep and goats have these fatty tails, and what's going to be relevant in this daf is that the fatty tail, it's called the aliyah. The aliyah of a sheep is part of the emurin, it's burnt on the mizbeach. The aliyah of a gedi, of a goat, is not part of the emurin. Now the question is, what about the hide of the fatty tail? Is the hide of the fatty tail considered meat, or is it not considered meat? And this is going to, the question is, how do we relate to it? But our Mishnah says that if one slaughters a korban with the intention of eating the hide of the fatty tail outside of where one's allowed to eat the korban, pasul. The aim bo karis, so it's pasul and there's no karis, because that's the halacha when it comes to chutz l'mkomo. When it comes to chutz l'mkomo, the korban is pasul, but there is no chiyuv karis, as opposed to chutz l'zmano, where there is a chiyuv karis, which we're about to get to right now. Lizrok damo lemachar or mixas damo lemachar. However, if instead of chutz l'mkomo, we have literally the same scenarios, but chutz l'zmano. So if one slaughters a korban with the intention of doing zrikas adam tomorrow, or part of the zrikas adam tomorrow, l'akter emurav lemachar, or to burn the parts that are meant to be burnt on the mizbeach, but tomorrow, or miktsas emurav lemachar, or part of the emurim tomorrow, lechol b'sar lemachar, or to eat its meat tomorrow, assuming that it's a korban that can't be eaten tomorrow, or kazayis mi b'sar lemachar, or even just a kazayis of the meat tomorrow, or lechol kazayis me'ora alya lemachar, or to eat a kazayis from the hide of the fatty tail tomorrow. Pigul v'chayav and olav karis. So this is pigul, and you will be chayav. One would be chayav karis for chutz l'zmano for these scenarios in the second half of the Mishnah, where the intention is to do something outside of the allowed time limit. Amazing. So be'etzem, that is sort of laying out the structure, the skeleton for pigul. The example used in the Mishnah was doing shchita. So one who slaughters an animal with the machshava. That's the big chiddush of pigul. It's all based on your intention, based on your thought at the time of the avodas sadam. The example in the Mishnah again was shchita. So one slaughters the korban with the intention of, now it's going to be either, is this on today's daf? I think today's daf already we talk about this, I believe. Achilas adam or achilas mizbeach, right? So one does one of the avodas adam with the intention of either eating the meat or doing zrikas adam / emurin, right? Zrikas adam and emurin would be considered achilas mizbeach, that the mizbeach is consuming the blood, the emurin, the specified parts that are burnt on the mizbeach, or achilas adam would be a person eating the meat. One has intention for doing either achilas mizbeach or achilas adam, either chutz l'mkomo, that would be pasul ve'ein bo karis, or chutz l'zmano, and that would be pigul v'chayav and olav karis. That is sort of the initial structure of pigul. Okay, so that was the first Mishnah. That was the Mishnah on today's daf, and now we get to the Gemara and the next section of today's daf, the hide of the fatty tail. Of course, in the Mishnah, we talked about eating a kazayis of the hide of the fatty tail, either outside of its proper place or outside of its proper time. Let us get into that. So it says the Gemara, Savrua or Alya ki Alya Dami. Okay, so let's assume that the hide of the fatty tail is like the fatty tail itself. And the assumption now also is that we're talking about a sheep rather than a goat. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, when it comes to a sheep, the aliyah, the fatty tail, is burnt on the mizbech. It's part of the emurin. You don't eat the fatty tail. The Rabban Shalom gets the fatty tail. So the assumption right now is that the hide of the fatty tail is treated the same way as the fatty tail itself, and therefore it belongs on the mizbeach being burnt as the emur, as part of the emurin. What's interesting here is that the Mishnah is talking about the person eating the hide of the fatty tail. And we're saying that if one eats the hide of the fatty tail with the intention, well, if one slaughters a korban with the intention of eating the hide of the fatty tail, let's say chutz lizmanu, so we're saying that would be pigul. Now, even though the hide of the fatty tail is really a murin, it's not something that you're supposed to eat. It's something you're supposed to burn on the mizbeach. And he's having a kavana not about burning on the mizbeach, but about eating it. And we're saying it would be pigul. Which is it's almost reminiscent of like the previous Mishnah that we had. I think it was the previous Mishnah that, you have intention of doing Zrikas Adam the next day, but it's supposed to go above the Chut HaSikra, but he's intending Lamatim Chut HaSikra, right? It's like similar here as well. He's having this Pigul kind of thought of Chutz Lizmano, but the thing is, you're supposed to burn the fatty tail, and here he's having thoughts about eating the fatty tail. The thing is that we're not talking about the fatty tail itself, we're talking about the hide of the fatty tail, but we're saying Savua or Alya Ke'alya Dami, but the assumption is that the hide of the fatty tail is treated like the fatty tail, and he's having a kavanah of Chutz Lizmano, or alternatively Chutz L'Mkomo, right? Either one, what was in the Mishnah. But he's having kavanah to eat it, but you're not supposed to eat the fatty tail. Again, he's having a machshava about something that's supposed to be burnt and consumed by the mizbeach, but he's having thoughts about consuming it himself. And we're saying that it's pigul. Shmuel says, Hamani Rabbi Eliezer, say no problem. This Mishnah reflects the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. The Rabbi Eliezer Taka says that that's the thing. Rabbi Eliezer says that you can have a kavanah for something that's supposed to be burnt on the mizbeach to be consumed yourself. It's not as well in a Mishnah. Wait, so again, it's not as we learn in a Mishnah. Somebody who slaughters a korban, lechol dover she'ein darko le'echol. Okay, so somebody slaughters a korban with the intention of eating something that is not normally eaten. Right, chutz lizmano, chutz limkomo, lahaktir davar she'ein darko lahaktir, or to burn something which you're not supposed to really burn. For example, the meat, you're supposed to eat the meat, not burn in the mizbech. Kosher. So the Tanakama says that the korban is kosher. Rabbi Eliezer posel. Rabbi Eliezer says posel. So we have a Mishnah where, when it comes to pigul, when it comes to chutz zman or chutz komo, for something that normally you're supposed to burn, but you had intention to eat it, or something normally you're supposed to eat, but you had intention to burn it, chutz zman or chutz komo, Tanakama says the korban is kosher because you can't mix up the achilas mizbeach and achilas adams. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer says, posel. Rabbi Eliezer says posel because you can. Right? If you have, for example, we're talking about the fatty tail, which you're supposed to burn, but he has intention to eat it. So that could be considered pigul, according to Rabbi Eliezer. So we want to say that our Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer. So when we talk about eating a kazayis of the hide of the fatty tail, we're assuming that the hide of the fatty tail is treated the same as the fatty tail itself, and that things that are normally burnt, you can have kavanah about it to eat it. So now the Gemara challenges this and says, wait a second, okay, so to make sure I'm clear, says the Gemara, you're telling me that this Mishnah that we just learned reflects the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, and that's why we're talking about pigul by thoughts about eating the hide of the fatty tail. But Ema Seifa, I will tell you I will read to you the Mishnah Daf Chavtes Amud Beis. This is the rule. Kol hashoichit ve'amikabel ve'amolich ve'azorik. Anybody who does any of the avodas adams. Lechol davar shedarko leechol. To eat something that is normally eaten. Ulaktir davar shedarko leaktir. Or to burn something that is normally burnt. Davar shedarko leechol in. She'ein darko leechol lo. So that Mishnah and Daf Chavtes Amud Beis, which is the Seifa of this Mishnah, it's a continuation of this Mishnah. That Mishnah talks about pigul specifically in the context of things, right, intentions to eat things that are normally eaten, or to burn things that are normally burnt. Not vice versa, not to eat things that are normally burnt, or to burn things that are normally eaten. So the Seifa seems to be like the Chachamim and not like Rabbi Eliezer. So why would Shmuel suggest that our Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer if the next Mishnah seems to not be Rabbi Eliezer? Asan the Rabbanon. So the next Mishnah is the Rabbanon. Reish Rabbi Eliezer v'seif Rabbanon. Are we saying that this Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer and then the very next Mishnah just magically switches to be the opinion of the Chachamim inconsistently? Amalei in. So I guess Shmuel, responds, yes, that's exactly correct. This Mishnah reflects the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. The next Mishnah reflects the opinion of the Chacham. That is the view of Shmuel. Rav Huna Amar, or Alya Lav ke Alya Dami. Rav Huna responds by saying, look, the assumption that we made that the hide of the Alya is treated the same way as the Alya itself, incorrect. Incorrect assumption. The Alya is burnt on the Mizbeach. The hide of the Alya is not. And therefore, if you have intentions to eat the hide of the Alya, chutz lizmano, or chutz limkomo, it's going to be a problem. Rav, my time with Rav Huna, Rav says, how come Rav Huna says it's chelbo ha'alya v'lo ora alya, that the pasuk says, I'm going to read the pasuk for a second. V'ikriv mizevach hashlamim ishel Hashem chelbo, you'll offer to the Rebbeinu Shalom on the Mizbeach, chelbo ha'alya, the chelev, the alya, the fatty tail. So chelbo ha'alya v'lo ora alya, says Rav in explaining the opinion of Rav Huna that what's burnt on the Mizbeach is the alya itself, not the hide of the alya, and therefore, if one were to, in terms of the hide of the alya, would not be something that's burnt, and if one has intention to eat the hide of the alya, chutz zmanu chutz mkomo, it will be pigul. So Rav Huna says that the alya, the hide of the alya, is separate to the alya itself. Rav Chizda Amar la'olam ora alya ki alya dami. Rav Chizda reverts back to what we were saying initially, that the hide of the alya is like the alya itself, but he says something very interesting, friends. Remember, I pointed out earlier that the alya is burnt on the Mizbeach for sheep, not for goats. Our Mishnah, when we're talking about pigul with the intention of eating the hide of the alya, which Rav Chizda says is like the alya itself, our Mishnah is talking about a goat. Now, when it comes to a goat, the alya is not part of the emurin. The alya is not burnt. Therefore, you can eat the alya. So, therefore, if one has the intention, slaughters a korban with the intention of eating the hide of the alya, which is considered like the alya itself, chutz zmanu, chutz l'komo, it's a problem. So that's because we're talking about a goat where the alya doesn't need to be burned; it can be eaten. And that is why it's pigul. Okay, I think to simplify things, I think I'll refer to both, unless it becomes clear to me going forward that this is inaccurate. But I think I'm going to refer to both chutz zmano and chutz l'komo as pigul. Kilu chutz l'komo, there's no chiyuv karis. Chutz zmano, there is a chiyuv karis. But as we're going to see shortly, even chutz l'komo could be referred to as pigul, at least in the pasuk. So I think instead of always having to say, if we're talking about chutz zmanu, kilu, the point is, if you have chutz zmanu, chutz l'komo are basically the same thing, except one's about time, one's about place, and they have different, one's chayv karis, one's not. But in terms of what you're doing, the avodas and achilas mizbeach, achilas adam, all of the ingredients are all the same. So kilu, if we're talking about slaughtering with the kavana of eating the alya, or the hide of the alya, that's really the same for chutz zmanu and chutz l'komo, so I'll just refer to it as pigul. Okay, fine. So therefore, Rav Chizda says that because our Mishnah is talking about a goat, that is why, or since a goat, the alya is not burnt, you can eat it, and therefore it will be pigul if you have machshavas chutz zmanu or chutz l'komo by the hide of the alya. Kulu kishmuel lo amrei. So I understand why Rav Chizda and Rav Huna are unwilling to hold like Shmuel. That's understandable. Because Shmuel, if you remember, he said that our Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer's Shita. And the next Mishnah is the Chacham's Shita. And that's weird that the flow is going from one Mishnah to the next and changing authors. It would be better if it was sort of the Reish and the Sefer were consistent. So therefore I can understand why Rav Chizda and Rav Huna would be unwilling to go along with Shmuel's approach, because that requires saying that this Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer and the next Mishnah is the Chacham. So again, Kulu kishmuel lo amri, because Reish Rabbi Eliezer v'Sefer Rabbanan lo mukmei. they're unwilling to say that that this Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer and the next Mishnah is the Chacham. They want consistency. They want to say both Mishnahs are the Chacham. Rav Huna lo amrei, and I can also understand why Shmuel and Rav Chizda are unwilling to say like Rav Huna, because Rav Huna says that the hide of the Aliyah is unlike the Aliyah, but they disagree. They say the hide of the Aliyah is, in fact, they say the halacha is that the hide of the Aliyah is like the Aliyah itself. Or Aliyah ke Aliyah dami, because they disagree with Rav Huna and they say that actually the hide of the Aliyah is like the Aliyah itself. Kamashmu, that's what they hold. Rav Chizda, my time alo ami. How come Shmuel and Rav Huna are unwilling to say like Rav Chizda, who says that the hide is like the Aliyah, just that our Mishnah is talking about a goat, not a sheep, so it's not part of the Emur. My kamaj malon. Well, the reason why Shmuel and Rav Huna don't want to go along with Rav Chizda is because, according to Rav Chizda, like, what's the point of the Mishnah then? Why did the Mishnah go out of its way to teach us about the hide of the Aliyah if the Mishnah is just talking about a goat? If the Mishnah is talking about a goat, then the Aliyah it's not the Emurin, it's just meat. We already said that if you have intention to eat the meat or kazayis of the meat, chutz zmanu, chutz mkomo, it's pigul. So why point out the hide of the Aliyah if it's essentially, if we're talking about a goat and it's just no different than the rest of the meat? So my kamazman or Aliyah ka Aliyah dami. What is the big chiddush to say? Oh, what it's teaching us is that the hide of the Aliyah is like the Aliyah itself. But Tanina, we already know that. In the following examples, the hide is like the flesh, or shetachas Aliyah, the hide that is under the Aliyah. So we have a beferish Mishnah that says that the Aliyah is an example of something that its hide is like its meat. So we don't need to teach that here. That wouldn't be a chiddush to be taught over here. So therefore, Shmuel and Rav Huna are unwilling to go along with Rav Chizda, because if you're saying the Mishnah is just talking about a goat, then why specify the hide of the Aliyah? What's interesting about it? Rav Chizda itzterch, whereas Rav Chizda would argue there is something interesting about pointing out the hide of the Aliyah by a goat, because I may have thought that when we say that the hide is like the meat, tuma dirokich mitzarif, I would have thought that maybe that Mishnah which is talking about the hides being like the meat is with regard to tumah, that since the hide is soft, it could join together in terms of the hide could join together with the meat, and it would create a kizayis for tumas, a kibeya for tumas ochlin, or a kizayis for nevela. But over here, when it comes to korbanis, where the pasuk says, I'm going to read the pasuk by Dabeshem alaharin. That when it comes to kodshim, it's like lemashcha, anointing, kingly. So avalacha ema lemashcha legdula. When it comes to kodshim, you want the best of the best. Kederech shamalachim ochlin. You want what the kings are going to eat. V'lo avide malachim de'achle and de'achle achi. The kings don't eat the hide of the fatty tail. Maybe the fatty tail they eat, but not the skin of it. So I may have thought that maybe when it comes to korbanis takeh, the hide is not like the meat, and therefore slaughtering a korban with the kavanah of eating the hide of the fatty tail chutz zmanu maybe wouldn't be pigul. So emalo, so maybe it wouldn't be pigul kamash malan. So Rav Chizda argues that the Mishnah, even though it's talking about a goat, and we already know that the kavanah to eat the meat of the goat would be pigul chutz zmanu chutz mkomo, but we had to teach also the hide of the fatty tail, because I may have thought by kodshim, since the kings don't eat it, maybe it would be excluded from pigul. So kamajmlan, it is included in pigul. If you have kavanah to eat a kazayis of the hide of the fatty tail chutz zmanu chutz mkomo, it's pigul. Meisvei, we have a contradiction, I believe, to Rav Chizda. Hashoichet is ha'ola L'aktir kazayis me'or shetachas ha'alya chutz l'mkomo pasul ve'ein bo karis chutz zman pigul v'chayav olav karis. Okay. Somebody who, okay, fine. Okay, Meisveh. Okay, we're gonna ask a question. Okay, we'll get to the, we'll sharpen the question soon. But anyways, Meisveh, we have a contradiction. Hashochet is a somebody who slaughters in a korban ola, lehakdir kazayis, with the intention of burning a kazayis me'or shetachas ha'alya, of the hide that is under the alya, the fatty tail, chutz l'mkomo, pasul ve'ein bo karis. If the intention was to burn it, chutz l'mkomo, so pasul ve'ein bo karis, chutz l'zmano, pigul v'chayav olav karis. If we're talking about chutz l'zmano, then there will be a chiyuv karis. Elazar ben Yuda ish ivlim, omer mishim Rabbi Yaakov v'chinayo, Rabbi Shimon ben Yuda ish kvar ikus, omer mishim Rabbi Shimon, echad or beis parsus behema, that when it comes to the hide of the, right below the knee, from the knee down of a behema daka, the skin from the knee down of behema daka, vechad or harosh shel egol arach, also the hide of the head of a less than 1 year calf, vechad or shetachas ha'alya, as well as the hide that is below the alya, v'chol shemanu chacham gabi tumah, and all of the things listed by Tumah that these are things that their hide is like their flesh, Lavi or Shobesa Boshes, to include also the hide by the genitals of the female genitalia of an animal. Chutzim Komo Pasul. When it comes to Chutzim Komo, it will be Pasul Vembo Kares, Chutzizmano, Pigul Chayav and Olav Kares. Okay, wow, that was kind of long. What's important to us? What's important to us is, continues the Gemara, Ola in Aval Zevach Lo. That we're saying, so if we back up to the beginning of the Bryce, it says, Hashoichet es Ola. Somebody slaughters an Ola, lahaktir kazayis me'or shetach za'alya chutzim komo. So basically, we're talking about slaughtering an Ola, and we're also talking about burning on the Mizbeach the hide of the Aliyah. So it would sound like the hide of the aliyah is like the aliyah, and at least when it comes to a sheep, we'll be burning it on the mizbeach. But now says the Gemara, back to where we are, about 5-10 lines before it gets wide. First one on the line is Ola. Ola in, right? The Bryce had specifically said, Hashochet is a Ola lahaktir kazayis, right? That we're burning the hide of the aliyah, specifically because we're talking about a korban ola where you burn the whole animal. Aval zevach, but any other korban, let's say a shlamim or a chatos, lo, we wouldn't be burning the hide, implying that the hide is different than the aliyah. By an ola where we burn the entire animal, okay, so also the hide memela is going to be burned, the hide of the aliyah, the skin of the aliyah. But when it comes to any other korban, sounds like we wouldn't be burning the aliyah, implying that it's different. We wouldn't be burning the skin of the aliyah, implying that the skin is different than the aliyah itself. So I understand, according to Rav Huna, it's perfect. Specifically by an ola where you burn the entire animal, okay, so when you burn the aliyah, you're also going to burn its skin. By all other korbanis, you're not going to burn the skin. That drives perfectly with what Rav Huna had said, that the skin, that the or ha'aliyah is not like the aliyah. So while by the other korbanos you'd burn the aliyah for a sheep, but not the skin, because the skin is different. But according to Rav Chizde, who had said that the skin of the aliyah is like the aliyah, my area the tani ola listen zevach. Why does it specifically talk about an ola, all korbanis? If the skin of the aliyah is like the aliyah, so then by all korbanis, just like the aliyah is burnt on the mizbeach, so should the skin be burnt. So Amalach Rav Chizda answers, Iba Yisema Ba'ayah Shel Gedi. Well, one way to answer it would be to answer it the same way they'd answered our Mishnah. to say that the brisa by the Ola is talking about a goat. So when it comes to a goat, because you're going to burn the whole animal, so you're also going to burn the aliyah along with its skin. But all other korbanos, when we're talking about goats, you're not going to be burning neither the aliyah nor the skin of the aliyah. This thing of burning the skin and the aliyah is specifically by, when we're talking about a goat, it's specifically by a korban ola, where you burn the whole korban. V'baisema tani zevach. The different alternative is to say, if you're asking why does it specifically say ola, it should say zevach, that all korbanos you should burn the aliyah. Okay, say that. Tani zevach. Say ashorchet is a zevach, with the intention of burning the skin of the aliyah, chutz zmanu, chutz l'komo. But by all korbanos, it would be a violation of Pigul. That would be another way to answer it. So we saw be'etzem a three-way machlokas between Shmuel, Rav Huna, and Rav Chizde when it came to the hide of the fatty tail. Shmuel and Rav Chizde said that the hide of the fatty tail is like the fatty tail. Shmuel had said that our Mishnah is specifically the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Rav Chizda had said our Mishnah is specifically talking about a goat, which is why there's pigul for intentions regarding eating the skin of the fatty tail. Because by a goat you wouldn't burn it. And Rav Huna says that the skin of the fatty tail is not considered like the fatty tail itself, and therefore it could be considered like food. Alrighty, and now we move on to the third and final, but we still have some work to do. But now we move on to the third section of today's daf, the source for pigul. Here we go. Okay, so the Mishnah had talked about chutz lizmano, chutz l'mkomo. Chutz lizmano is pasul pigul v'yesh bokar v'chayav and olav kares. Chutz l'mkomo is pasul v'ein bokares. So now we're going to minani mili. How do we know this stuff? Amar Shmuel says Shmuel trei kroi ksive. Well, okay, so interestingly, there actually are two psukim that talk about pigul, which we'll be talking about. Interestingly, when Shmuel says trei kroi, he's actually not talking about the two psukim. Let's talk about the two psukim for a second. There's one pasuk in Parshas Tzav. In Parshas Tzav, this is the longer of the two psukim, right? The pasuk is going to talk about the Kra Aricha, I think, and the Krazuta, something like that. The longer one, I'll read you the longer one, is V'me'achol ye'achol mibsar zevach shloma v'ayom hashlishi lo yirotza amakavoso lo yichoshiv lo pigul yiyeh v'nefesh ha'ochla mimena avona yisa. That's the longer pasuk. The shorter pasuk is in Parshas Kedoshim, and it simply says V'me'achol ye'achol v'ayom hashlishi pigul lo yirotza. That's the shorter pasuk. So there's two psukim that talk about pigul. When Shmuel, however, talks about trei kroi right now, he's actually talking about the longer pasuk and two sections in the longer pasuk from Parshas Tzav. So now, how do we know about chutz lizmanu and chutz l'mkomo? Omer Shmuel says Shmuel trei kroi ksive. We have two psukim. Really, what he means is that there's two parts in the longer first pasuk, and we are going to later on really dissect that pasuk like word by word and learn out lots of different things. But anyways, Shmuel focuses on two parts of that pasuk. What are we talking about? Amar Rabba comes Rabba to explain Shlishi zeu chutz lizmanu, that when the pasuk says where am I? No, I'm sorry. When the pasuk says shlishi, so if we're talking, right, it says we're talking korban shlomim, right? Zevach shlomov. Talking about korban shlom. So shlom, you have 2 days to eat it. Comes the third day. So when it says shlishi, the third day, that's beyond the scope of the amount of time that a korban shlom is allowed to be consumed. So zeu chutz lizmanu. So when it says shlishi in the pasuk, that is a reference to chutz lizmanu. Pigul, and later on when the pasuk says pigul, which I believe Rashi points out. Does Rashi point this out? Pigul, yeah, exactly. It's extra. Right, because after all, right, the pasuk already said, I'm reading the pasuk again. It won't be good It won't be kosher. So what's added by Pigul? Zeu chutz limkomo. That is a reference to chutz limkomo. So we're looking for something that's similar to chutz lizmano, right? So just like chutz lizmano is beyond the scope of time, so here it's beyond the scope of place. Chutz limkomo. Okay, fine. V'anefesh ha'ocheles mimenu, and when it says v'anefesh ha'ocheles mimenu, then it says avono tisa, and we're going to there's going to be a lot of drushes on this. We have for the rest of the daf and tomorrow's daf as well. We have a lot of drushes ahead of us. So when it says v'anefesh ha'ocheles mimenu, and then it says avono tisa, which we're going to be learning out shortly, means a chiyuv karis from Gzer Shava, avon from Noser. Anyways, so basically when it says v'anefesh ha'ocheles mimenu, from it. So 1 second, we just had two things. We had chutz lizmano and chutz limkomo, and then we say v'anefesh ha'ocheles mimenu, from it, which is singular. Echad v'lo shnaim, only one of the two, only either chutz lizmano or chutz limkomo is going to be chayiv karis. As we know from the Mishnah, we know that chutz limkomo is the one that is not chayiv karis, and chutz lizmano is the one that is chayiv karis. But anyways, the pasuk says v'anefesh ha'ocheles mimenu echad v'lo shnaim, only one of them is going to have a chiyuv karis. Zeu chutz lizmano, which one? Chutz lizmano. V'lemute chutz limkomo, to the exclusion of chutz limkomo, which is there's no chiyuv karis. But fact the Gemara ve'ema v'anefesh ha'ocheles mimenu zeu chutz limkomo v'lemute chutz lizmano. But wait, I'll say the opposite. Maybe mimenu is coming to say one of them, and that one is chutz limkomo is chayiv karis. Chutz lizmano is not chayiv karis. Mistaver chutz lizmano odif. Probably chutz lizmano is the one that's chayiv karis. How come? The pasuk be, because it was the first one mentioned in the pasuk. First it talked about shlishi, which we said chutz lizmano, and then it talked about pigul at the end, which is chutz limkomo. Adrabah fakir chutz limkomo adif disomichle. No, I'll say chutz limkomo is probably what it's talking about, because it's the one that's closer to v'anefesh ha'ocheles mimenu. Right? If you look at the pasuk, it says pigul yiyeh v'anefesh ha'ocheles mimenu avono tisa. That was a pigul who is a reference to Pigul Yiyeh, is a reference to chutz limkomo. So I say it, since chutz limkomo is the one that is right next to v'anefesh ha'ocheles mimenu, I'll say that is what hanefesh ha'ocheles mimenu is talking about. Chutz limkomo. That's where your chayiv karis. So basically, we're kind of stuck now. We're kind of stuck. Shmuel had said it's not from this pasuk. Rabbi had explained Shmuel as saying that when it says shlishi, it's chutz lizmano. Pigul is chutz limkomo, and then you chayiv karis for chutz lizmano. But we had trouble drilling down, really nailing down why it's chutz lizmano that you be chayiv karis for. Maybe it should be chutz limkomo. So Ela Amar Abaye, rather says Abaye, ki also of Yitzchak bar Avdimi Omar. When Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Babble, Omar, he said, Rav Somich Adatani Tana. Rav relied upon the following brisa, or whatever this Tana taught. Kishu Omer Shlishi beParshas Kedoshim. Okay, so Parshas Kedoshim is the second pasuk, the smaller pasuk. So Rav is actually dividing the two drushes into two different psukim. So according to Rav, the first pasuk, the bigger pasuk from Parshas Tzav, is talking about chutz lizmano, doesn't say anything about chutz limkomo. The smaller pasuk from Parshas Kedoshim, that pasuk is dedicated to chutz limkomo. So again, because Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi Omar, Rav Samach Adatani Tanik Shu Omer Shlishi beParshas Kedoshim. When the smaller pasuk from Parshas Kedoshim talks about Bayom HaShlishi, right? I'm going to read the smaller pasuk. V'me'achol yachol Bayom HaShlishi Pigul lo yiratzeh. So when it talks about Shlishi in that pasuk, that why do we need that pasuk? We already have the pasuk from Kedoshim from Parshas Tzav. We already have that whole elaborate pasuk. I'm going to read the elaborate pasuk now. Also, so why are we repeating it again in Parshas Kedoshim? This shlishi business. I mean, in the chutz lizmano, if it's not talking about chutz lizmano, because the first pasuk, the bigger pasuk from Parshas Tzav is talking about chutz lizmanu. So Taneuin and chutz l'mkomo. So let's say then that the second pasuk, therefore, in Parshas Kedoshim, the smaller pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim is talking about chutz l'mkomo. Now, friends, let's point out a few things now. Firstly, let's point out that by neither of these two psukim, neither the bigger pasuk in Parshas Tzav nor the smaller pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim, neither one says anything about kares. Neither one says anything about kares. We're saying one of them is chayiv kares. We don't know why yet, right? The first pasuk says, "V'nefesh ha'ocheles mimenu avon tisa." The second pasuk says nothing really, right? Doesn't even say avon tisa. So now, friends, this is important. So in Parshas Kedoshim is the smaller pasuk, right, that I just read. So that's the smaller pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim. In Parshas Kedoshim, the very next pasuk is the ochlav avono yisa. So now we say avono yisa. Ki as kodesh Hashem chilav v'nichrisa hanefesh imamel. The very following pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim, following the smaller pasuk, talks about kares. Now that pasuk though is talking about noser. Wow! So we got stuff spread out. In Parshas Tzav, we have this whole big pasuk that's talking about chutz lizmanu. In Parshas Kedoshim, we have a smaller pasuk that's talking about chutz l'mkomo. The very next pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim is talking about noser, and there it says kares. Okay. How are we going to piece together all these pieces? So now it says the second line on Daf Chav Ches Amud Beis, u'mi'et rachmone gabe noser, and that next pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim, the one that talks about kares, which is a pasuk about noser, it says ve'ochlav, the one who eats it, avono yisa, lim'utei chutz l'mkomo. That when the pasuk, so meaning in Parshas Kedoshim, which is what we're focused on right now, in the smaller pasuk of Bayom HaShlishi in Parshas Kedoshim, we said that that's talking about chutz l'mkomo. The very next pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim is talking about noser, and there it says kares, and it says ochlav avono yisa. The one who eats it will be chayiv kares. The one who eats noser is chayiv kares, not the context of the previous pasuk, which was chutz l'mkomo. Chutz l'mkomo, there's no chiyuv kares. Okay, so all we know right now is that by noser it says v'nichrusa, it says that there's kares by noser, and it says v'ochlav, the one who eats it, the one who eats noser, to the exclusion of chutz l'mkomo. So chutz l'mkomo is not going to have a chiyuv kares. Okay. Again, second line of Chav Ches Amud Beis, u'mi'et rachmana gabe noser. The pasuk says by noser ve'ochlav avono yisa. The one who eats it, the one who eats the noser, avono yisa, and it says v'nichrusa, it's going to be chayiv kares. Lim'utei chutz l'mkomo, to the exclusion of the previous pasuk of chutz l'mkomo, there's not going to be a chiyuv kares. Ve'ema ve'ochlav avono yisa zeu chutz l'mkomo v'lim'utei noser. But wait, maybe I'll say that when it says ve'ochlav, the one who eats it, maybe it's saying the chiyuv kares is davka by the chutz l'mkomo, and what's being excluded is noser. And maybe noser is not chayiv kares. Maybe the chiyuv kares is by chutz l'mkomo. Right? The pasuk said, the previous pasuk is talking about chutz l'mkomo. It says v'me'ochel yochel bayom hashlishi pigul lo yirotz, and then it says v'ochel v'avono yisa ki es kodesh Hashem chila v'nichrisa. Okay, maybe that's all talking about chutz l'mkomo, and there's no chiyuv kares by noser. Again, to say that there's no chiyuv kares by noser. So says the Gemara, no, here's the thing, friends. Here is the thing. So now here's the other piece. Here's the other piece, as I alluded to earlier. There's a lot of pieces here. The other two I alluded earlier is, how do we know the chiyuv kares by chutz lizmano? How do we know the chiyuv kares by chutz lizmano? It doesn't say, right? If we say the big pasuk in Parshas Tzav is talking about chutz lizmano. Doesn't say anything there about kares, but it says v'nefesh ha'ocheles mimenu avona tisa. And this pasuk that we just quoted, and we're saying it's talking about noser, and it says kares, it says v'ochel avono yisak. So the reason why we know that chutz lizmano, which we're saying is learned from the pasuk in Tzav, the big pasuk in Tzav, talking about chutz lizmano, the reason why we know that chutz lizmano is a chiyuv kares is because it says avon in that pasuk, and also says avon in this pasuk that talks about kares. So just like the pasuk that talks about avon in kedoshim has a chiyuv kares, so also the pasuk that mentions avon in Tzav, which we're saying is talking about chutz lizmano, also have a chiyuv kares. Now, getting back to the pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim that talks about kares, the question is va'ochlav. Va'ochlav, is that talking about is noser chayiv kares? Is chutz l'mkomo chayiv kares? Right? This is the big argument now. Right? We're saying, okay, chutz lizmano is chayiv kares because it says avon and Tzav and gzer shava to this pasuk here that says avon and specifically says kares. Fine. The question is, what's the topic? What's the subject of this pasuk in Kedoshim that talks about kares? Is it noser, or is it chutz l'mkomo, which is the subject of the previous pasuk? So we want to say that the subject of the pasuk by kares in Parshas Kedoshim must be noser, can't be chutz l'mkomo. Why? Because as we've said, as I just said, ultimately chutz lizmano, the chiyuv kares for chutz lizmano in Parshas Tzav, in that big pasuk, is going to be learned from this pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim that talks about kares and says avon. It says avon in the big pasuk in Parshas Tzav, and in this pasuk by kares it says avon. So ultimately we're going to be learning out the chiyuv kares of chutz lizmano from this pasuk. So it would make sense that this pasuk is talking about something that's relevant to chutz lizmano, and we want to say what's the thing that would be relevant to chutz lizmano, that chutz lizmano would be learned on from this. We want to say that is noser. So mistavra noser havale leukme bekares. It would make sense that this pasuk by kares in Parshas Kedoshim is talking about noser and is not talking about chutz l'mkomo, because lemigmar avon l'chutz lizmano, because ultimately the chiyuv kares for chutz lizmano in that big for the big pasuk in Parshas Tzav, which talks about chutz lizmano and says avon, the chiyuv kares is going to be learned out from the fact that it also says avon in this pasuk by kares, and therefore if we're learning out chutz lizmano from this pasuk, it would make sense that this pasuk is talking about noser. Didamile bezav, because chutz lizmano is similar to noser in that they both share zav. What does zav mean? It's not talking about zav like a zav and a zava. It's not talking about that. It's talking about zayin beis. Zayin being zman, I think, and beis being bama. Is that correct? Yes. That both chutz lizmano, zman, and noser, which is defined by time, right? Time went by and it was left over, and also bama, right? Both chutz lizmano and noser apply to bamas, right? During periods where you're allowed to offer korban nedavas, neders, nedavas on your own private altars. So, if let's say you're going to offer a korban shlamim on your own private altar, it's still a korban shlamim. You have to eat it within 2 days. If you have intention when you're slaughtering it to eat it in 3 days from now, or if you leave it over more than 2 days, so noser and chutz lizmano apply to a bama. So because noser and chutz lizmano have this zav acronym in common, it would make sense to say that since chutz lizmano, the chiyuv kares, is being learned out from this pasuk that talks about kares, it would make sense that this pasuk is also talking about noser rather than chutz l'mkomo, because noser has that commonality with chutz lizmano in terms of the zav acronym, zman and bama. Adrabah fakert fires back the Gemara. Chutz l'mkomo avalei leukmei bikares limigmar avon l'chutz lizmano fakert. This pasuk by kares should be talking about chutz l'mkomo. And yes, chutz lizmano, the chiyuv kares for chutz lizmano is going to be learned out from this pasuk. And it makes sense that this pasuk is talking about chutz l'mkomo because the damile b'mikdash, another acronym, because chutz l'mkomo has commonality with chutz lizmano with the acronym mikdash, which stands for machshava, right? Both chutz lizmano and chutz l'mkomo, we're talking about you have a thought during one of the avodas adams for eating, whatever, achilas mizbech, achilas odom, right? So they have in common the machshava. Kuf is ktsas, that right, even though you only have kavana for part of the avodas, it still is going to postal the korban. Dam, right, during the avodas adam is when you're having this kavana, and shin is shlishi, right? It says shlishi in both psukim. So therefore, I'll argue fakert. This pasuk by Karis, from which we're going to learn out the Chiyuv Karis for Chutz Lizmano, from Gzeira Shava. From this pasuk, it would make sense that this pasuk is Davka talking about Chutz Limkomo, because it has this mikdash commonality. So Elam Rabbi Yochanan, rather says Rabbi Yochanan, Tani Zavdi Bar Levi. Zavdi Bar Levi taught, look. This is not a matter of debate. This pasuk is talking about Noser from a Gzeira Shava. I say Kodesh, because we have a Gzeira Shava of Kodesh, another Gzeira Shava, right? The Gzeira Shava that learns Chiyuv Karis by Chutz Lizmano is Avon. This is now a separate Gzeira Shava of Kodesh to teach that this pasuk by Karis is Davka by Noser and not by Chutz Limkomo. And this Gzeira Shava is Ksivacha Kies Kodesh Hashem Chilel V'Nichrisa, right? The pasuk that we're talking about in Kedoshim says Kies Kodesh Hashem Chilel V'Nichrisa. It says Kodesh. Uchsiv we have another pasuk that says V'Sarafta Es Noser Ba'esh. And it doesn't say it's in the Gemara, but the continuation is Ki Kodeshu. So it's talking about Noser and it says Kodesh. So Malahala Noser, so just like when it says Kodesh, in the other pasuk it says no, it's talking about Noser. So Afkan, Noser. So this pasuk also, which talks about Ki es Kodesh Hashem Chilel V'Nichrisa, it is talking about Noser as well. So that is settled. That the pasuk here by Karis is talking about Noser. Umiyet Rachmana Gabe Noser. Ve'ochlav avona yisa lemutei chutz limkomo mikaris. And so again, I've got noser. So mit rachmana gabe noser, and over here by noser, by the chiyuv karis, by noser says ve'ochlav it, those who eat it, avona yisa. So it's those who eat it, those who eat noser, there'll be a chiyuv karis lemutei chutz limkomo mikaris, to exclude chutz limkomo from Karis. So Chutz Lizmano has Karis, because we learn out the Gzeira Shava of Avon from this pasuk over here in Kedoshim, where it says Karis, and this pasuk by Kedoshim is talking about Noser, which we learn out from a different Gzeira Shava of Kodesh. My chaz is the Kra Aricha b'Chutz Lizmano b'Shishat B'Ashas Kedoshim Tiave Chutz Limkomo. But now we're questioning, why are we assuming that the bigger pasuk in Parshas Tzav, from which we're saying Le Gzeira Shava of Avon, and that pasuk is talking about Chiyuv Karis, why are we assuming that pasuk is talking about Chutz Lizmano? Who said? We've just been assuming all along. The big pasuk is Chutz Lizmano. The pasuk in Kedoshim, the smaller one, therefore must be talking about Chutz Limkomo, and it's excluded from Karis. Maybe the big pasuk is talking about Chutz Limkomo, and maybe it's Chutz Limkomo that's Chayiv Karis, and it's Chutz Lizmano that is not Chayiv Karis. Ipuchana. I'll flip it around. Say the big pasuk is Chutz Limkomo, the small pasuk Chutz Lizmano. Mistavra Aricha b'Chutz Lizmano. Now it makes sense that the longer pasuk is talking about Chutz Lizmano. Why? The Gomer Oven Minoser D'Damile Bezav. Because after all, as we know, from the big pasuk, we're learning the Gzeira Shava of Avon from the pasuk in Kedoshim, where it says the Chiyuv Karis, and we established that pasuk in Kedoshim by the Chiyuv Karis is talking about Noser, and we also established that there's a commonality between Noser and Chutz Lizmano of Zman and Bama, which neither apply to Chutz Limkomo. So therefore, it makes sense that since the Gzeira Shava of Avon is between Noser and the pasuk, the big pasuk in Tzav, it would make sense that the pasuk in Tzav would be Chutz Lizmano, so we can make that connection between Chutz Lizmano and Noser, because they have that Zav acronym in common. Right, Mistavra Aricha b'Chutz Lizmano, the Gomer Avon Minoser, the Damale Bezav. But for the Gemara, Adarabba, Aricha b'Chutz Limkomo. No, fakert. I'll say that the longer pasuk is talking about Chutz Limkomo. The longer pasuk is talking about Chutz Limkomo. V'shlishi de Kedoshim Tiu b'Chutz Lizmano. And the smaller pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim, which is right before the pasuk that talks about Noser, is talking about Chutz Lizmano. Mishum de Damile Samche v'Komemaitle. And I'll say that because, yes, there is a commonality between Chutz Lizmano and Noser, that's why we want to bring them together. Right? These two psukim are one right after the other. They're both in, let's say that they're both in Parshas Kedoshim. Let's say that's talking about Chutz Lizmano, and immediately the next pasuk is talking about Noser, V'ochlav avona yisa. So let's say that the pasuk in Kedoshim is talking about chutz lizmanu, and that's because of the commonality with noser. It's right next to noser. But the fact of the matter is then that by noser it says va'ochlav, that only noser is going to be chayiv kares and not chutz lizmanu. And the big pasuk in Parshas Tzav is talking about chutz l'mkomo and say that the gzer shav of avon and chutz l'mkomo is chayiv kares. So again, we got stuck in trying to figure out which one is the chiyuv kares. We had Shmuel's opinion, as described as explained by Rabbah, that both chutz lizmano and chutz l'mkomo were learned out from that big pasuk. Shlishi is chutz lizmano, Pigul is chutz l'mkomo, but we got stuck trying to figure out how do we determine that it's chutz lizmano, that's the one that's chayiv kares, and we got stuck on the same thing here. Now we tried a little bit differently. We said the big pasuk is chutz lizmano, the small pasuk is chutz l'mkomo. And we learned out the chiyuv kares from Gzer Shava, but now we got stuck again. How do we know that the big pasuk is chutz lizmano? Maybe the big pasuk is chutz l'mkomo, and it's chutz l'mkomo that's chayiv kares. So we need a better source. So says the Gemara, Elo amar Rove, rather says Rove, Kulu mikra aricha asun. Okay, so it now says Rava that actually everything is coming from the big pasuk in Parshas Tzav. And as I said earlier, we're now going to go through this pasuk piece by piece. Everything is learned from the big pasuk in Parshas Tzav. The pasuk says, Hey ochol ye ochol. That when the pasuk says Hey ochol, let me actually read the pasuk quickly, just to remember, to remind everybody what we're talking about. This is the big pasuk. V'mei ochol ye ochol. Mibsar zevach shlomav bayom hashlishi. Lo yerotze amakriv oso lo yechoshev lo pigul yeyev anefesh ochel zmen avono tisa. We're going to learn out things from lots of different sections of that pasuk. So now, from he'ochel ye'ochel b'shtei achilas hakosim medaber achas echad achilas adam ve'echad achilas mizbech. As we've seen before, that from he'ochel ye'ochel we say that pigul applies to two achilas. If the kavana is about achilas adam, right, the person eating the meat outside of its allotted time, or achilas mizbech, that's either zrikas adam outside of its allotted time, or aktaras emurin outside of its allotted time. Mibsar zevach shlomov, mashlomim mifaglin umispaglin. Just like by a korban shlomim, you have all the ingredients necessary for pigul. You have the avodas adam, which are mifagel. Those are the stages which the thought will be mifagel, will create the pigul, and the thought is about the mispagel, is about zrikas adam, is about haktar semurin, is about achilas basar. So it's got both sides of the coin, of the pigul coin, the mifagel and the mispagel. I've called mifaglin or mispaglin. So also pigul applies to scenarios like that, where there's the mifagel and the mispagel, to the exclusion of, let's say, a minchas kohen. A minchas kohen is kalil tokter, I think, is entirely burnt on the mizbech. I think there isn't even the concept of a kometz. You just burn the whole thing. So therefore, there isn't going to be a pigul applied to. There's not going to be pigul there. Shlishi ze chutz lizmanu. Oh, okay. When the pasuk says shlishi, that's talking about chutz lizmanu. Lo yerotze. Yerotze is a reference to zrikas adam. Ki artzoas kosher, kein artzoas posel. Just like the ritzui, the effectiveness, of the korban by a korban kosher, that's also by pigul as well. Ma'artzoas kosher ache yakrivu kol matirav, afartzoas posel ache yakrivu kol matirav. Just like when it comes to a kosher korban, right? When, as we know, when is the kapara of the korban? By the zrikas adam. At the conclusion of all the avodas adam, shchita, kabbalah, olacha, with the zrikas adam, the kapara of the korban has been achieved. The same thing applies to pigul. If one slaughters a korban with the intention of chutz lizmanu, but then all the blood spills on the floor, so there's not going to be any pigul. Pigul only happens at the completion of the zrikas adam. Hamakriv, when the pasuk says hamakriv be'akrovahu nifsal v'enu nifsal bashlishi, when does pigul happen, friends? It happens at the time of the offering of the korban, right? Meaning, if somebody simply eats a korban chutz lizmano, right? If it's a korban shlam, you have 2 days to eat it, and you eat it on the 3rd day, that's not pigul. Pigul is a makriv also. Pigul is at the time of akrava. It's that when I'm slaughtering it, when I'm doing kabbalah sadam, halacha sadam, zrika sadam, it's at that time, the time of the akrava is when I'm having the pigul thought. That's when the pigul is happening. It's not happening later on. Also, when it says also, it means bizevach akosov medaber, ve'enu medaber bekoyin. What it means is also the korban itself is what's possible. It's not that the koyin who's doing the avoda of the korban now is possible forever. He can no longer be a koyin. No, it's not that. It's the korban is apostle korban. Lo yechoshev, lo ye'era ba machshavos acheres. This is a halacha of pigul that we're going to get to, I believe, on the Mishnah and Daf Chav Tes Amud Beis, which I haven't learned. I've learned the Mishnah when I learned Mishnah Zevachim, but I haven't learned it yet just now. Anyways, in order for pigul to apply, right, there has to be, right, it's achi karvu kol matirah. Basically what happens is, let's say the pigul is that we slaughter the korban with the intention of doing the zrika sadam chutz lizmano. So if you then do kabbalah sadam, halacha sadam, zrika sadam, even bizmano, it doesn't matter. But since the kavana, you had the kavana during shchita of chutz lizmano, and then you did all of the rest of the avodah sadam kosherly, that's pigul. But if you had kavana during shchita of chutz lizmano, but then you had a different machshava during kabbalah of chutz limkomo, well then the kabbalah was messed up. So it wasn't all of the rest of the avodah sadams kosherly, so therefore it won't be pigul. In order for that to be pigul, all of the rest of the avodah sadams have to be done correctly. So lo yechoshev lo ye'ariv ba machshavas acheres. Any other puzzle thoughts will take it out of the category of pigul. Pigul ze chutz limkomo. When it says pigul, that's chutz limkomo. So shlishi is chutz lizmano. Pigul is chutz limkomo, and the pasuk says pigul. So we see both chutz lizmano and chutz limkomo in this big pasuk. Yiyeh, when it says yiyeh melamed shemitztarfin ze imze, that when it says yiyeh, it means that even they could join together. So for example, if you slaughter the korban with the intention of eating half a zayis chutz limkomo and half chutz lizmano and half a zayis chutz limkomo, they could join together to passel the korban. V'nefesh ha'ocheles mimenu echad v'lo shnayim, when it says v'nefesh ha'ocheles mimenu, from it, i.e., only either chutz lizmano or chutz limkomo is going to be chayiv kares, not both of them. Ve'eze ze chutz lizmano, which is the one that's going to be chayiv kares? Chutz lizmano. The gomer oven minoser dedamile bizav. Okay, and that is going to be chutz lizmano is the one that's going to be chayiv kares because it's learnt out from oven from nosar, and chutz lizmano has the similarity with nosar, with the Zav acronym, Zman and Bama, and therefore it's going to be Chutz Lizmano, which is the one that's Chayiv Kares. Amalei Rav Papa l'Rava says, Rav Papa to Rava l'Didach, but according to you, Shlisha de Parshas Kedoshim Tiyu my Darshas Be. Okay, Rava, Givaldig, you learned out everything from the big pasuk in Parshas Tzav. But what about the little pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim? What do you learn from that? Sahumi Baile Limakum Shieh Mishulish Bidam Bibasu Ve'emurin. What that is teaching me is about makim, is about chutz limkomo. What is considered chutz limkomo? If you slaughter a korban with the intention of eating it in the heichel, is that chutz limkomo? Why would you be eating it in the heichel? Maybe that's chutz limkomo? No. But what we learn out from the shlishi in Parshas Kedoshim is that there's a trifecta for the definition of chutz limkomo, and that trifecta is that it needs to be a place where you can do zrika sadam, eat the korban, as well as burn the emurin. And for example, in times of heter abomis, during times when you would be allowed to offer korbanos in your backyard, so you would be able to make a bama in the azara. I'm sorry, in the Chatzar Beis Hamikdash, outside of the Beis Hamikdash. One second, chutz la'azara, kachim kalim, chutz la'ir, kilu in play, right? If you thought to eat them either outside of the azara or outside of Yerushalayim by kachim kalim, These are places that you'd be able to make a bama. And if you make a bama in these places, a private altar in these places, you would do zrikas adam. You would burn the emurin on the bama. You would eat the meat in these places, to the exclusion of the heichal, where you're not burning emurin, where you're not eating meat. So say mishulish bedam bebasar uve emurin. That is what Rava learns out from Shlishi in the pasuk in Kedoshim. Typically, mikra kamer meyochel yochel mida apke rachmana biyom belashon shlishi. But why not just learn that out from the first big pasuk? From the fact that it uses the word shlishi in the big pasuk, learn out this trifecta. Rav Ashi says, Rav Ashi, I'm recently shmaita kamer of Masno. And he said to me, if from the first pasuk havamina shlishi prat pigul klal. I would say, well, the first pasuk says shlishi, but then it's followed by pigul. I would say shlishi is specific, pigul is more broad. When I say klal, musaf ala prat, and then you have prat uchlal, v'yisrael b'shar mekomos, and I'll say that all places are included, even places that don't have the trifecta kamash malon. Therefore, we have the second pasuk which just says shlishi, it doesn't say pigul, and therefore, actually, wait, it does actually say pigul, but I guess maybe the it being extra maybe in the second pasuk is to say that specifically we need this trifecta in order to be considered chutz lim komo. Gevaldik, friends, that was Daf Chaf Ches of Masechta Zevachim. On Daf Chaf Ches of Masechta Zevachim, we learned Pigul basics. We learned a new Mishnah all about Pigul, about chutz lim zmano, about chutz lim komo. We learned about the hide of the fatty tail. We saw 3 opinions about this hide. Shmuel said it is considered meat and it would be burned together with the emurin, but eating emurin can be pigul, right? He says that our Mishnah is like Rabbi Eliezer, that even though yes, the hide is considered like the rest of the aliyah, and it should be burnt when we're talking about a sheep as part of the emurin, but even if you had kavanah to eat the emurin, chutz l'zman or chutz l'mkomo could still be considered pigul, and that's like the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. We saw the opinion of Rav Huna, who said that the hide of the fatty tail is not considered meat. Right, it would not be considered the emurin that would be burnt on the mizbech, and it would be, and you would, if you have kavanah about eating it, chutz l'zman or chutz l'mkomo, it would be pigul. And the opinion of Rav Chizda is that it is considered like part of the aliyah, and if that's the case, and it should be burnt in the mizbeach, and if that's the case, then why would it be chayiv for pigul for having kavanah about eating it? It's because our Mishnah is talking about a goat, and by goats you don't burn the fatty tail on the mizbeach, and therefore you can eat it. And if you have kavanah about eating it, then we're getting into pigul stuff. And then we moved on to the source of pigul. We saw an opinion from Shmuel, we saw an opinion from Rav. Those were, ultimately, we got stuck trying to figure out, is it chutz l'zmano or chutz l'mkomo, that's chayiv kares. And then we saw a source from Rava that seems to have checked all of the boxes, learning it all out from the big pasuk in Parshas Tzav. Friends, that was Daf Chof Ches of Masechta Zevachim. Hope you enjoyed. Cheers.